I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So let me open with, welcome to Compensation Uncomplicated, Navigating Compensation in a Shifting Talent Landscape. I'm sure that will resonate for everyone who's joined us. Myself, I'm Ruben Moreno, founder and CEO of Blue Rock Search, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Nate Young, founder and chief comp strategist at Paidwell. This is our second session in this series. If you missed our first session, which is about 3 months ago, you can email us directly. You'll have email addresses and contact information at the end of the session. I'm happy to forward you a copy of that link. And just to set some context as we step into today's session, the macroeconomic environment today continues to be, the best word I can come up with is unpredictable. We played around with the word volatile. That's probably a good adjective as well. In January and February, the job reports came in under forecasts. And then in March, came in 88,000 jobs above forecasts, right? So kind of net gain in jobs in Q1, but pretty kind of different spikes coming into March. In addition, as the founder and CEO of an executive search firm, continuing to see kind of the ongoing tension between employers wanting employees and candidates to return to the office, and both employees and candidates, definitely reluctant to do so. And this is particularly challenging when trying to attract, we call it, high demand, low availability talent. Many of the senior level candidates that I interact with on a day-to-day basis, not only is it a must-have, they're pretty direct and transparent about their feelings on Flex First. So if you think about those things, the macroeconomy and what we're seeing from an employee and candidate perspective, challenging times that require, kind of intentional comp strategy, which is why we thought this was a very well-timed topic for this session. As you'll see on the next slide, our marketing team definitely took some editorial privilege with the shifting landscape. So, uncertainty peaks, definitely seeing lots of those these days. Retention valley, starting to see, particularly this is the time of year, post bonuses and so forth, where we start to see some of that attrition. And then total rewards ridge, what is it that we're trying to accomplish? And does our total reward strategy reflect that? What changes, do we need to make? So, with that said, Nate, you're a trusted advisor, to your clients who call on you for this. And in this duo, you're absolutely the subject matter expert. So I'm going to hand the mic over to you to provide some, advice and actionable insights, which is really what the audience signed up for. So, Nate, handing it over to you, sir.
All right, sounds good. All right. So I think the main thing I would stress here for most folks is to make your comp work for you. I know that's something that's easy to say and sometimes very difficult to do, right? Being reactive rather than strategic is the thing I think a lot of folks, especially outside of HR, tell us quite a bit. But I would say that being said, I think it's important to be reactive and strategic right now, right? So thinking about what is your company culture and what are you trying to get done? What do you have to get done this year? What promises have you made, right, to your board, to your CXOs, to your investors, to your team members, you name it. But the key thing to keep in mind here is going to be that compensation as a whole, you have those levers to make it work for you. And when I say that, when you talk about things like volatility, right, your key talent still stays your key talent and maybe even becomes more importantly your key talent. Hey, real quick, Ruben, you're not frozen there. Yep. Yep, just a heads up. But basically, in short, what you see is that like your compensation for a lot of folks in your organization may actually reflect their impression of how you're doing or how you're not. So thinking about moments where if you're having a year, maybe you're coming out of a year where you didn't hit target, and maybe you're cautiously optimistic, or and I think that Ed's comment here was cautious growth. You're in that ballpark. It may feel like to folks in the organization, hey, we're growing, we're doing the thing, but I didn't get a raise, right? And you might have to reconcile that messaging, that misalignment might actually drive some attrition, right? And the key thing you want to always keep in mind is that you want to think about your core strategy, right? And what you're trying to get done and where you're trying to go this year. And I would actually think about maybe even holding back just a little bit if you can, just to account for that extra volatility, to allow some flexibility for you and your teams. And when I say holding back, that could be budget, that could be time, that could be things on the roadmap that you're going to get done this year. I know that sounds kind of silly. I wouldn't suggest anyone sandbag, right? However, if you're going to create those offers that attract and retain, and maybe you're slowing hiring now, maybe later in the year hiring will ramp. If you spend all your money now, right, sign-on bonuses, whatever the case is, that makes it harder later. If you're going slower now on hiring, that means you may have extra money to put towards merit for mid-year or later, right? And the key thing through all of this, and this is something I think that a lot of folks will say, and I think it's important to say again because it's cliche for a reason, top performers are top performers in any market, right? Your budget does not dictate necessarily whether or not those folks are top performers. And the key thing to keep in mind is that during a slow period for a lot of businesses, that might be an opportune time for you or your competitors to look for top performers at other firms, right? Meaning that, hey, if things are slower, stock is down, bonus program's not paying out, that kind of thing, that makes you vulnerable, but also creates opportunity, right? And the last thing I would say on top of this is to staying on top of your market data. Things are going to move quickly, especially when things are volatile, flexible, ambiguous, complex, whatever phrasing we want to use here. The key thing to keep in mind is that if you're checking your market data, say once a year, now's probably not a bad time to think about checking it twice a year, maybe even every quarter. That doesn't mean you're going to be changing your bands every quarter or running a cycle every quarter. It may just mean you may want to keep a close eye on where things are going, especially coming out of this 2020 to 2022, 2023, I'll call it gauntlet, right? Staying on top of your market data right now to make sure you're not getting too far ahead or too far behind your skis is probably a really good idea. We can go on to the next one. There we go. And this is the piece here where I would say that corporate identity, like what are you trying to accomplish and who do you want to be? If you are paid for performance, even if you are having a slower year, right? Or you're, cautious about the year, that's even more time to focus and double down on pay for performance, right? Making sure that where you are, quote unquote, placing your bets or giving those key talent your raises, that you do so on key talent. And I would argue here, and Ruben, I'd be more than happy to hear your opinion as a person owning a search firm. If you have the slower year, right, and you think to yourself, hey, wait a second here, I'm a little bit worried about budgets. Now's not the time to peanut butter, right? It's a peanut butter meaning everyone gets that, the same amount, maybe it's below market. It's probably a better time to invest in and make sure your key talent, right, understands your talent trinity that you like to talk about, Ruben, and also making sure that if you have that budget that you do have allocated for increases, giving everyone, for example, 2% may not be ideal when you could give key talent or above, level performers 4 or 5%. Might not be a bad year to think about folks that are below band or below performance standards or even meets expectations. If they're not underpaid, maybe going flat. What are your thoughts around on those other pieces?
Yeah, Nate, I see a couple of things, right? In the first one, and we talk about the talent trinity quite a bit, right? Culture, compensation, career, which one is the most important? The answer is yes, right? We have to be, we advise our clients all the time. You have to be, in today's market, you have to be exceptional at all three. Because if you attract someone with a great compensation package, but culture and career are not there, it's really difficult to retain them, and vice versa. The other thing that I'm seeing in terms of being able to pay your top performers and keep talent, and I'm definitely seeing this, both on the public sector, publicly traded companies and private equity, is really expanding roles where the luxury of the person who does one thing exceptionally well, particularly at senior levels, no longer exists. I'm seeing a lot of bolt-on activities. So, for instance, corp comms becoming part of the corporate CHRO's job responsibility. Asking individuals to take on a number of sub functions within HR, which is where we spend a lot of time on. So it's having folks wear multiple hats and paying top performers for doing that, and ensuring that there's a strategy on culture, comp, and career. It's actually in our 2025 HR compensation report. We talk about that talent trinity, and there's a pretty good recent blog on the topic. So
Yep.
thanks for letting me chime in there.
Yep. And I would add here before we switch, I've got a question for you. Maybe a good transition to the next slide. But the first thing I would kind of double click on here, at least me personally, there's a phrase here I heard from my boss during the 2008 2009 recession, and the phrase he used was horizontal job loading, right? That meaning, hey, you're going to have more job complexity, more stuff to do, but not necessarily more pay. Having command of the message of what people actually want, not just comp, is really important. And that's where I would ask you, like, what does top talent like really want? Like, how do we make sure that we're addressing their needs? It's not just comp needs, especially if our budgets are constrained. Like, what would we need to do to think about how to best reward people and or the talent trinity, and think about those offers that attract and retain that you'd like to talk about.
Great transition, Nate. Thank you. So, you think about it from a top talent perspective, right? It's, comp is definitely part of it. I alluded earlier, right? Kind of flexibility, flex first, looking for growth, both from a professional development standpoint, as well as even, responsibility, because, folks are looking at it and realizing that the broader their skill set, the higher their value in the market, given where we're at, on the both on the publicly traded side and the private side, the equity portion. And interestingly enough, I spoke to CHRO of fairly large, privately owned organization, and he actually talked a little bit about, how with senior level executives actually starting to look at going back to publicly traded companies from a wealth accumulation standpoint, because in longer holding periods with private equity, instead of 4 to 5, we're looking at things like 8 to 9. Some senior executives are opting to go back to publicly traded because those 8 or 9 are based upon an actual event being realized or a transaction. Whereas on the publicly traded side, it's real long-term wealth accumulation through RSUs, performance shares, et cetera. And then last but not least, mission alignment and purpose. One of the pieces here, when you look at all 5 of these, mission alignment, purpose, equity, flexibility, growth, balance, it is definitely not one size fits all, because there's a lot going on right now in terms of who is actually in your workforce. So for instance, we have one client that has 5 generations in their workforce. Each one of those generations actually has a different mix of which one of these is important. So having a real strong handle on who's in the building is a great place to start before you even talk about how we're going to pay them.
Yep. And I double click on that and add the comment as well, not just to make sure you have it, to make sure folks understand it. Because this is something I will say personally, I see this quite a bit with our customers. We put all this effort into building that program, and we maybe don't spend the time we maybe should on communication and change management. Make sure those leaders and those management folks that are in charge of those, the key talent, have command of the message and know how to articulate it and how to talk more about it.
So, Nate, you want me to start here on building offers that attract and retain?
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. What are your thoughts if you were to give someone like your top 2 to 3 tips here in a market like ours right now? What would you do differently, or what would you focus on?
Yeah, and this is one, obviously, this is what we do, and we have these conversations a lot, from the offer facilitation process and how we recommend offers. Probably one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing now in all of our offer recommendations, while we may or may not have the exact data from a candidate perspective, obviously, salary history, pay bands make it, a little bit more challenging, but we talk about comp openly with all of our candidates. In the marketplace today is we really take a very market-based approach to compensation, where we bring comp data to the table relative to, for that job in your industry vertical for a company of your size, what is the market rate for that role? And that is also not just base pay, but also variable pay. So base, STIP, LTIP. And really focus on, what is the winning offer for that role, given the key critical nature of that job. And then and then take it from there, as opposed to, I remember when I started doing this business 20 years ago, we would look at it and we would say things like, well, in today's market, a reasonable expectation would be a 10% increase over, what you make. And if you've got 17% over current, that would be an exceptional offer. But everything started with current compensation levels. The market and we have started has gravitated away from that and more around, in today's market on a real-time basis, what is this job worth? Because it's not just about attracting that talent, it's also about retaining that talent.
That's right. And I'll steal this one from your playbook, but I don't think you mentioned it today, is the first best last, right? Like just do the best offer you can give up front, right? And I will say I see usually whenever I have a conversation around either the comp is wrong or something similar, we could have paid more and didn't, or we have the job misleveled, which is a different whole nother discussion to be had. But I often will have that conversation and say, well, you could have offered more, but didn't. Why not? And you had the candidate's expectations, which were higher, right? And that's when I will say that right now, key talent is still pretty selective. And I think people should keep that in mind.
Yeah, and again, then I'll go back to my point around kind of high demand, low availability talent, right? It just goes back to macroeconomics. That's supply and demand. When demand is outstripping supply, price goes up, and we're definitely seeing that in key jobs, specifically in HR. Definitely seeing right now, VPs of total rewards are definitely at a premium.
Yep. Yep. Okay. All right, and I'll talk through this slide a little bit. I'm also going to cover Ed's question here at the same time. So Ed's question was, are you seeing top candidates at venture-backed startups still open to trading lower salaries for greater equity? Or given the current uncertainty, are they increasingly prioritizing higher cash compensation over long-term equity potential? The short answer is, I would say it varies. At VC-backed companies, what I will say is that for the most part, funding has unlocked, so there is more cash to be had, right? A lot of those firms may not be profitable and may not even be, cash flow positive. And if that's being the case, trading on cash might be coming at a premium, right? And what I will say is that this answer is probably important with some context, because what I'm seeing is that for our VC-backed customers, and what I will say here is this is in particularly, I would say, focus on tech. But in short, VC's funding, for the most part, has gotten a lot less frequent and a lot lower over the course of the past year or so, right? Probably 2 years. That being said, with less cash on hand, what we saw, and this is the market data plays out based on the salary surveys we have access to, we're seeing lower cash, specifically lower base salaries. And a lot of VC-backed firms are actually going to be switching their focus, or have already switched their focus, to focus on incentives. So bonuses and equity. Candidates, on the other hand, right, may be seeing lower salary power based on inflation, whatever the case is. Their pressure is always going to be more on, and I'd say candidates and employees, on cash. Cash is top for a reason, right? That being said, this is something I would pivot back to folks, and this is what I've coached my customers on. Let's say theoretically you're in a public company or a private company where the stock value right now might be depressed, right? That feels bad. I understand that. I've been there, right? I joined a company that later went public, and I came in right after a down round, and it did not feel good. However, if you're coming into that business or you're getting equity in that business now, now's the time you want it, because each equity share is worth less, not worthless, worth less. Now's when you want it, because you get more shares, especially if you're looking at like RSUs or like performance shares or something similar. And stock options would probably go into the same bucket. And this is why I'm talking about pay for performance. Performance is not just individual performance, it's also company performance, right? So back to our market, performance metrics and compensation, right? Giving someone a bonus right now based on company performance, that's a great way to make sure you're placing your bets in the right places, right? If you do have limited cash. If the company is maybe coming at 90% target, you might want to focus on, or less, by the way, we want to focus on those folks that are moving the needle and are, I would call regrettable attrition. The second piece of this is not in the slide, but kind of under this performance metrics compensation bit. Also talk about company performance. Hey, right now, and I'd say as a note here, Ed, you didn't ask about this, but I'd also throw tokens on into this category as well, because we're seeing a lot of companies start to use tokens in addition to stock options, PSUs, PIUs, PBUs, and other types of long-term incentives and the bonuses. But what I'm getting at here is that now's the time to get in, because when those things are worth less than what maybe they could be, especially if you have some kind of historical marker to say, hey, this is worth less than it was 6 months ago, 3 months ago, 12 months ago, you get more of it, or the spread, the growth potential you have in that vehicle is a lot higher, right? So the short answer for you would be, I think that venture-backed companies, especially startup stage, should always index on equity where they can, but spend some extra time communicating, hey, our token value, our RSU, our stock option may be worth less than maybe it could be. That's when you want it. This is when the money is made, because you're not trading it now. You're trading it, do future you a favor, right? And think about, hey, if I get this and it's worth $1 now, but 3 months ago it was worth 10, that's $9 in spread that you can gain, right? At a lower price and a lower transaction value for yourself. Later on, future you will thank you, right? And the short answer is, I'm actually seeing a lot of startups actually index towards not letting folks trade off cash for equity or vice versa, simply because that flexibility bit is something that probably comes during a much higher talent demand market. I think right now things are inconsistent. So we're seeing a lot of companies put a damper on that and focusing on the traditional basis for this, right? Bonuses are for annual performance, company and individual, and LTI or token LTI, right, is going to be what's going to happen over the next 4 to 8 years. And the last thing I would say here is performance is a great way to focus to make sure you eliminate bias and prioritize transparency. And this is a note I always like to make for other folks, and this is not a political statement, but right now we get a lot of questions around, hey, there's a lot of work being done that maybe the E&I maybe not had the same priority it had before, or the EEOC or the Department of Labor or these other government entities that might, for the US side might be involved in preventing bias and making sure we're being transparent. Just because there are political statements being made and or the decisions being made at some level around whether or not these groups are doing what they should or not, doesn't change the law yet. As if it's still illegal to do certain things or you are legally required to do certain things, I would certainly do them until it is no longer required, right? And the last piece of that is ensuring leadership is driving success without undue pressure. If you have limited resources, your leaders are going to feel that pressure. Now's a great time to sit down with them and talk about that talent trinity that Ruben mentioned earlier, the employer value prop around career development, lifestyle and culture, and rewards, not just rewards. And where we are giving raises, emphasize it's okay to give the better performer more money, especially if they're paid less than their peers. And it may be a conversation to have around with someone who maybe isn't hitting their targets as well, or is, maybe fairly paid, but maybe an average performer. They may not get an increase this year if you have limited budgets. And that's some support your leaders might need to hear and get and or be pushed to do so that they don't just peanut butter the money around and dilute the messaging that you have. All right. So who gets paid? So this is the part where I would say back on what I just mentioned here. I'm going to double click on that, right? Fair pay isn't just about same pay, right? Same level. It also needs to keep into account performance, right? So thinking about basically who's going to get what, the best way to avoid resentment is be transparent about your expectations in a role. If you perform better and you are getting paid worse now, you will get more of our budget for increases. If you are performing worse and you are paid better in your role, you will get less of our budget, maybe even none of our budget. That's the best way to just be super clear and clean about what your expectations are. And if everyone knows the score, if someone leaves, but we know that they're, a weaker performer or they're higher paid than their peers, something similar, we can all accept that responsibility together. It's not ideal. I'm not saying you need to push people out or something similar, right? But communicating that pay strategy internally is absolutely critical in any time, but doubly so when you might have limited resources or uncertainty around, hey, maybe we're going to hold back some of our budget to mid-year just to see how things play out. That's a common strategy I'm seeing right now. I see a lot of companies bumping their comp cycles from Q1 to Q3, right? Because they want to see what's going to happen in the year. Unless you align your internal leaders around that to make sure we're all on the same page, at least we have the same command of the message. And the phrase I like here is we either need to disagree and commit or we need to agree and commit. But those are the options, right? If you don't have that, that's where you're going to see that that resentment and flight risk that may be even created by your leaders as opposed to being managed by them, right? All right. So market benchmarking. This is one we talked about earlier. This is that volatility thing I mentioned around and being flexible and reactive. This is a good time to say, hey, get ahead of where you're seeing market trends. Because if you pulled your bands in Q1 of 2024 and you aged them at the end of last year for your bands this year, I would definitely go back and double check your bands. What felt like maybe economy's looking up, funding is flowing, acquisitions are happening, stock shares are up earlier in the year, may be different now. You're going to see the same thing play out on base bonuses and equity for people that are submitting their data in Q1, right? There's always that slight lag between when data comes into your survey tools and when you get it. So what I would suggest this year, if you have the bandwidth or capacity, or a partner you could work with to do it, I would check your bands and benchmarks every quarter this year if you have that available data. Even if you do not plan to change your base salary ranges or your bonuses or equity, whatever the case is that you're offering. And the reason I say that is because we saw this in 2021 to 2022. When things are moving really quickly, the ball can bounce really fast. And then, they say keep your eye on the ball. Market benchmarking is what compensation person's way of keeping their eye on the ball, right? Where are things going? What are the trends doing? And I would say not just individual jobs, but trends. So for example, we see cash coming down over the course of the last 12 to 18 months. We're seeing total direct comp go up. What that means is incentives are actually going up and companies are I would call it battening the hatches for future growth in a slow period or when they expect volatility, right? They're still going to be there in 3 years, right? Whatever the case is when you're looking at how long this uncertainty may last. What I'm getting at for the crew or for the folks in the call today, though, is thinking ahead and looking at your data as much as possible, right? Being informed never hurt anyone. However, there are plenty of people who didn't look at their map and got lost, right? And that's where I would say here when you're thinking about what to do, doesn't mean you have to do anything with it. It doesn't mean you have to take action or re-benchmark or run an off cycle or something similar. All it means is that when you start to see the trend and then you validate it, maybe one or two quarters of data, you can get ahead of that and be more competitive and better spend your budgets, right? To keep those key talent to make sure they don't go anywhere and to make sure you're attracting the key talent you need to kind of win next year or the year after when the uncertainty kind of starts to subside. And or just because there's uncertainty, I would say doesn't mean there's not money to be made, which means this year you still have work to do. You still have payroll to make. You still have an AOP you committed to 3, 4 months ago, 5 months ago now that we're trying to all hit, right? Getting ahead of that, making sure that when you see the market data change, I would check it as often as you possibly can. Even if it is just half a year, whatever the case is, I would stay on top of it. Okay.
Yeah. So if we thank you for that, Nate. That was awesome. And
Yeah.
as we think about it, right, kind of the trends to watch in 2025 and beyond, and Nate just talked about it, right? The benchmarking, but looking at the economic headwinds and adjusting as needed, being highly cognizant of the fact that I tell all of my clients, right, uh, hybrid is here to stay, right? With the exception of some of my very large manufacturing clients who literally never went away from 5 days in office. Hybrid flex first is a reality that we all have to kind of come up with our own approach and response to. Equity versus bonus mix, to Nate's point, what's that right mix? And based on what your culture is, but also what's going on in your industry, because you obviously want to be cognizant of what the very people you're competing with for that talent, what they're doing, and talent pipeline for tomorrow. I think in the environment we're at, where there are so many things that are quote unquote external beyond folks' control, the clients that I see that are really working diligently to stay ahead of it is workforce planning, which I don't have any client who's totally figured it out. But from that workforce plan, there's a talent pipeline strategy. And with that talent pipeline strategy, it feeds also the total reward strategy, right? Because those are three things internally we can control: the workforce plan that drives the talent pipeline, that drives the total reward strategy. Those things, help dramatically at, dealing with the shifting landscape that we're all experiencing today. Anything you want to double click on there, Nate?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. The only thing I would add here is that not to get ahead of your skis, right? And if you're one of my customers and you're on the call, one thing I would double click on here, you can always bring things up. It's very, very difficult to bring things down. So when you're thinking about that pay mix and bonus and equity and that sort of thing, if you're not sure where things are going to go, you might want to hold on rising or increasing those amounts, right? Or over indexing on guaranteeing anything. And the idea there being that you may want to wait to see how things play out and give yourself some flexibility, right? Whereas if you bring those folks up now or roll out a new program right now or increase your amounts now, and then later on you're facing stronger headwinds, it's a heck of a lot harder to walk that back and we apologize, but the kind of thing, than it would be to say, hey, we're just going to leave it flat for now. We understand that we would love to raise these as well, right? However, bringing it up later feels great. Bringing it down later feels terrible.
Nate, you hit on this several times. I'm going to, end with this one as an exclamation point. There is an assumption when we do all of these things that our employees and prospective candidates will respond accordingly. The challenge there is the whole comms piece, right? What are we doing to actively and proactively communicate what it is that we're doing, what our philosophy is, and not making the assumption that people will understand and or know. I mean, there is a definitive comm strategy that has to support this, because you could actually be in a great position in terms of 75th percentile and all the things that you're doing, but your workforce doesn't necessarily know it or understand it. And that's a miss that sometimes we coach through to say, okay, what's the comms plan to support this, to make sure you're actually, quote unquote, getting your bang for the buck.
That's right. And one of the anecdotes here that I'd probably flag, and Ruben, get your Grammys music ready if I'm over talking on this one. But what I would say here is the phrasing is the definitions of a placebo and a nocebo. A placebo, right, in medicine is something that gives you the benefits of real medicine because you think it will, right? So when you go to your employees and say, hey, this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, even if you're not changing anything, reinforcing the messaging of what they already have might make your current strategy work better than it is currently already just by talking about it and making it clear, right?
Yeah.
A nocebo is where you think it will not work and it actually is medicine and it actually doesn't work because you don't believe in it, right? So if you go and do all of the work that you could to solve the problem the organization has, give people what they want, and you don't tell anyone about it, and or your messaging isn't as loud as the folks that are saying, well, things change, that's got to be worse, right? They're just giving us a higher bonus because they want to hold it back later. Not that anyone would ever say that, but let's say theoretically they would. That nocebo effect is a real thing. And you can take something where your business is legitimately investing in a component to make things better. And if you don't have command of the message or on how people respond to that message or to that component, it might actually harm things because it's created change and ambiguity that people don't understand. And that nocebo effect is real. That's all I got. Dr. Rubin to kind of close out, maybe handle some questions. Got a couple here in the chat.
Yeah. So we'll open it up. Thank you for everyone who joined, and you'll get a copy of the video for future viewing. But we'll open it up. For a brief Q&A, and then we'll end with our contact information if anyone has a desire to have a follow-up conversation. So Ed, Nate, you can see the chats because I've got my screen up.
Yep, I was actually going to ask you one. I've got one here, a question that came in that says, I recently extended a competitive offer, top of range, to a non-sales candidate, but she requested a draw or sign-on bonus as a way to secure guaranteed income. It felt unusual, especially since the role wasn't tied to variable compensation. It runs counter to the pay for performance philosophy we apply across the board. I'm not sure if this reflects a broader shift in the candidate expectations or is just an isolated case, but it definitely stood out as non-standard. Ruben, any thoughts on that one?
That's an interesting one for me because particularly if they're quote unquote, when we provide coaching and counseling on sign-ons and guaranteed income, the first basis for that is keeping the candidate whole. Are they leaving something on the table that we have to make up for in year one, and usually just kind of year one? This one doesn't sound like the person is leaving something, so we're keeping them whole. It's incremental or guaranteed income. So it sounds like low risk profile, guaranteed income, stepping into kind of a pay for performance culture. So it sounds like an isolated incident. Actually, it begs a question for me from a cultural fit perspective. Would the person be a fit, kind of given the misalignment between their desire for guaranteed comp, stepping into an organization that espouses pay for performance, but feels more isolated? I don't see that as a trend today. Nate?
Yep, and I would second that. What that probably says to me, and this is something that's a note. Ruben said it. I'm gonna say it very clear, just in case. Is that essentially what it comes down to me is that compensation is a requirement for a job. We want to talk about knowledge, skills, abilities, all of that. If someone is not in the salary range or they're asking for accommodation, right, in terms of their I want a sign-on bonus, something like that, and they haven't provided to you a justification why, it may just be a grab, right? It may just be a, hey, I'm transitioning now, so why wouldn't I ask? If they're not taking a pay cut, if they're not walking away from potential bonus on deck or equity that could be paying out or vesting soon or something similar, usually whenever I see some kind of ask for a guaranteed bonus or something or a sign-on bonus or something along those lines, it's usually because they are asking because they can, right? And the key thing for you is going to be, is that what you want to reward? Or would you rather say, hey, I love that idea. I'm going to tie it to your first half year goals. We're going to go ahead and I agree to that sign-on bonus, but you're going to be paying it out in 6 months or 12 months based on you hitting these goals. That's a great way to reposition that, Ed, to turn that back into a performance-based bonus if you even agree to it. And then that way you're not giving them something when you know the least amount about that person. All right. I think we're coming up on time. Just want to flag for other folks here. Are there any questions, comments, or feedback you'd like to provide to us? Please let us know. Anything you'd like to dig into? Otherwise, we have our contact information here on the screen, including our cell phone numbers and email addresses. You can reach out to either one of us with any questions or concerns. Anything we can help you with or advise you on as well. Ruben, you usually offer to advise for free, right? For introductions, just like, hey, bounce something off me.
Absolutely. Yeah. We, anybody from this, if you want to schedule a call and just do a 1 hour session on whatever topic on this piece, or, organizational consulting, obviously we spend a lot of time with our HR clients. Happy to do that. That's a benefit of having joined the session.
Yeah.
And Ed, thank you very much for being
Yeah.
an active participant and asking questions to get us going. Appreciate it.
Love that, Ed. And I would stress for other folks, if there are any other questions you'd like to ask, or you want to, hey, I'm seeing this, or has anyone dealt with this kind of situation, please just let us know.
Wonderful. Well, everyone have a great rest of the day, and thanks for joining us for today's session. Have a good one.
All right, take care.
Take care.
Cheers. Bye.